Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stéphanie Tawalama, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to a new session of the CSH workshops. Workshops are scientific events organized by the CSH, whereby a work in progress is being presented in order to generate discussion. And today's speaker is Baishakh Chakrabarti. Baishakh is a historian specializing in economic, financial, and community histories in late 19th and early 20th century in India. His PhD dissertation was on gambling, speculation, commodity exchanges, and the making of the small investor in colonial India, 1867-1943. He recently completed this PhD from the South Asia Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania. And at the CSH, he has been a postdoc fellow since September. And as such, he belongs to the domain called documenting democracy, history, politics, and citizenship. So Baishakh's paper has the intriguing title, Ignorant Student, the Pedagogic and Operational Logic of the Contract in the Colony. So Baishakh, you have about 55 minutes, and then we'll have discussion together. For those of you who are online, please, can you please mute yourself for now? Of course, you can record your questions in the chat box, and we'll give you the floor after Baishakh's presentation. Baishakh, floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. Just as housekeeping, I'm just going to say slide whenever I want the slide changed, and Neeru, if you could just operate the slides, and I'll get into it straight. Okay, Neeru, could you move to the next slide, please? So the man who has escaped the Marwari's grip with a whole coat on has the makings of a finance minister in him. These words conclude a section titled "A Solemn Warning." I'll just indicate the slide. So yeah, thank you. These words conclude a section titled "A Solemn Warning" in the Marathi social reformer B.M. Malabari's polemical piece on the Marwaris of Gujarat and Bombay provinces. His prejudice may be traced to a perception generated towards the community in the build-up and aftermath of the Deccan riots in 1875. Part of a series of rural unrest spurred by agrarian distress, the Deccan riots turned emblematic of the balance needed when marrying the principles of political economy to the rapidly changing social relations of agrarian production. The riots, which ostensibly concerned the high indebtedness of the cotton-cultivating Marathi Kunbi peasants of Western India, spawned discussions regarding commercial farming and contracting, land dispossession, and political unrest. Having occurred shortly after the Indigo and the Southall rebellions, the political ramifications of the Deccan riots had once more put the sustainability of credit-based cultivation and commercial agriculture in question. The riots precipitated the passage of the Deccan Agriculturalist Relief Act in 1879, an emergency law that targeted predatory lending and land alienation. Its more enduring impact was the imprint it left on the colonial imaginary, convincing a sizable section of officials that the unrest was symptomatic of brewing socioeconomic upheavals exposed by commercial cultivation. Eventually, the Deccan riots drew in the colonial state more intimately in the role of mediating a neoteric fiscal and legal relation between the moneylender and the peasant. By doing so, it incited two coeval yet contradictory impulses within the government machinery. One, engaging its paternal instincts that germinated from the needs of political stability, while the other addressing its theoretical commitment towards the tenets of political economy, which in turn was tied to the process of wealth extraction. Thinking through this contradiction, the paper today looks closely at the discussions held between 1892 and 98, which finally led to the amendment to the Contract Act in 1899. It therefore examines the explicit tensions between protectionist and free market discourses, first highlighted during the Deccan riots, particularly when it came to the principles of free contracting and free bargaining in the colony. So the Dara was only a palliative for the early faults emerging in the system of commercial agriculture. A broader and more permanent solution was still required. So Shortly after the passage of the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885, a nationwide discussion contemplated limiting small peasant indebtedness and land transfers without harming the existing system of rural credit. From 1892 to 98, the government of India contacted judges, legislators, revenue and police officers for their opinions regarding the same. Notably, the discussion touched on expanding the term undue influence so as to incorporate the categories of simplicity and ignorance. Simply put, could contracts struck between a peasant and a moneylender be declared void if the lender had exploited the borrower's ignorance and committed the latter to blatantly unfair terms? The amendment also contemplated allowing judges to declare unconscionable contracts void where its terms contradicted the tenets of equity. In the correspondence, officials expressed sympathy towards the condition of smallholding peasants. The more affective accounts even furnish specific details of predatory lending. The opinions resist racial categorization since both sets of officers, Indian and British, lamented the condition of the small cultivator while also drawing attention to the precarious conditions in which the rural usurer operated. The sheer volume in responses impedes general elaboration, so let me start instead with an emblematic characterization of the problem as stated by a judge in the Calcutta High Court, Justice Syed Amir Ali. Next slide, please. Neeru, yeah, thank you. A person borrowed rupees 4,000 from a Mahajan in one of the Bihar districts, and in 8 years, the amount swelled to rupees 32,000. There was no doubt as to the extortionate character of the claims, but it was a free bargain, and in the absence of any special circumstances, the court had to deal with the case. Felt they had no discretion to reduce the claim for interest. Ali's harsh reading of the freedom of contract went against 18th century liberal doctrines, a principle grounded as early as 1787 when Jeremy Bentham had declared that one should be at the liberty of making one's own money bargain, adding that this meek and unassuming species of liberty has been suffering much injustice. In Bengal, however, the English East India Company set its sails against these continental winds. Within 5 years of Bentham's public defense of the individual's right to determine interest on money contracts, the government of Bengal capped this amount to 6% and 12% for secured and unsecured loans respectively, with Madras and Bombay following in 1802 and 1814 respectively. The prevalence of rural usury predated the company, of course, as peasants frequently borrowed to pay off land revenue demands under the Mughals, while smaller amounts went towards personal expenditures like marriages and festivals. As evidenced from the prevalent rate of near 150% charged on simple interest bonds in Bengal during the 18th century, only a nominal eye regulated this market. It is unclear whether the limits imposed by the company on interest rates provided actual relief to rural borrowers. Interestingly, in 1855, only a few months before the conclusion of the Sautal Rebellion, an uprising precipitated by high tribal indebtedness, Act 28 was suddenly withdrawn. The repeal had a crippling effect on the cultivators of the hinterland. The Deccan riots exposed the fallout of this unregulated market, and by the time of the correspondence regarding the amendment, several officials appeared eager to forward rebuttals to Bentham's vision of liberty. However, more than just a theoretical disagreement, the force of Ali's objection is only understood. Sorry. Yeah, just yeah. It's yeah. All right. The repeal had a crippling effect on the cultivators of the hinterland. The Deccan riots exposed the fallout of this unregulated market, and by the time of the correspondence regarding the amendment, several officials appeared eager to forward rebuttals to Bentham's vision of liberty. However, more than a theoretical disagreement, the force of Ali's objection is fully understood when placed against the demands of commercial agriculture. Accordingly, the system as a whole deserves closer scrutiny. It wouldn't be misleading to suggest that the Bengal Tenancy Act of 1885 signaled a shift in the government's economic strategy in the subcontinent. The act reflected the state's declining faith on zamindars, both as capitalist farmers and as loyal political subjects. A related change concerned the nature of wealth extraction, in which land revenue was heavily complemented, even sidelined, by usuriously financed agriculture. Commercial farming heralded India as a site for cheaply produced cash crops that serviced globally integrated manufacturing industries located overseas. While it expanded unprecedentedly from 1870s, its origins are traced to the infrastructural advancements of the 50s, especially with the expansion of technologies like the telegraph and railways that provided peasants of the hinterland information regarding real-time prices of commodities, as well as the facility to transport them to coastal trading points. The railways also nurtured national grain markets, thus allowing cultivators to shift their land acreage from food crops to commodities like cotton, jute, poppy, tea, sugar, oilseeds, and tobacco. With the notable exception of tea, which was cultivated in plantations, many of these commodities were produced through a putting out system, where through advances, the merchant financed the peasant, even as the latter controlled the means of organization of production. It was the intricacy of this system that bred the phenomena of widespread rural debt. Brilliantly thick descriptions of the arrangement are found in Omkar Goswami's and Shaugata Mukherjee's studies of jute cultivation in eastern India. To give an idea of the system's complexity, Goswami shows how between the fields and the consumer, jute went through 9 layers of intermediaries, 3 transport systems, the mill sector with its conflicting entrepreneurial groups, speculators, shippers, balers, 11 industry and trade associations, and importers. The chain also demonstrates just how far removed the average peasant was from the market for which he or she produced. Sugato Bose views this as a conceptual problem, one where the market came to the peasant rather than the other way around. Only a fifth of the peasant's produce in jute, for example, was sold directly by cultivators and local haats, that too by jotedars or large peasants. The rest was procured by a series of intermediaries like the fariyas, who are itinerant peddlers, beparis or merchants, and arhatiyas, secondary market merchants. While some fariyas were self-financed, most were local-level purchasers or commission agents for arhatiyas. More than just middlemen, these figures remained crucial in linking the production centers of the hinterland with trading ports. In fact, in spite of the power wielded by European baling houses, the day-to-day movements of raw commodities like jute remained primarily in Marwari hands, the lower end occupied by the Marwari Arhatya, and the upper end in the hands of wholesale exporters. This dominance in procurement, storage, and marketing of raw commodities increased significantly after the First World War. The nodes of control made little difference to the average Bengali Rayat, however, since his labor and marketing power remained subordinate to the monopsony of the commission agent and moneylender. Eventually, the manner in which the crop was acquired remained tied to the system of credit fueling its production. Like jute, cash crops for export like opium, cotton, sugar, oilseeds, and tobacco were cultivated through credit instruments like satta patras or karja patras. These instruments or direct cash loans were advances that covered the peasants' costs of production, which included seed purchases, maintenance of drought animals, labor charges for weeding and harvesting, etc. Why the Marwaris came to dominate this credit market is explained by the command this tightly knit banking community held over streams of capital, which they preferred to keep liquid instead of as investments like other business communities like the Parsis. Let me now turn to the operation of the cash advancements and see how they came to dominate peasant labor. The earliest example of this system was first witnessed during the indigo cultivation in Bihar and Bengal in the late 18th and mid-19th centuries. European planters would advance cash payments to small proprietors so they grow indigo on their lands. In the absence of a formal contract law, Act 5 of 1830 made breach of contract a criminal charge, though it remained a veneer for the brute force employed by European planters and Bengali factory officers operating the system. The cash advancements led to the maintenance of a debt ledger and a loan account for the peasant that was partly cleared when he delivered the crop. The first signs of systemic resentment appeared in the early 1850s, when the price of grain grew higher than that of indigo. Peasants demanded the right to self-determination, many preferring to grow the more remunerative rice crop. Extra-legal coercion through illegal confinement and torture hardly dented their resolve, and by 1859, the cultivators declared open rebellion against the planters' demands. Armed with stamp paper agreements and books of accounts, the planters took the cultivators to court, accusing them of breach of contract. A majority of these cases were dismissed by their judges, and others were withdrawn by the planters themselves. The rebellion catalyzed an immediate vigor, one that led to formalizing a nationwide contract act. By 1866, a committee headed by John Romilly completed the first draft of the Act, and the task was completed by Sir Henry Maine in 1872. With an eye on the conditions of indigo cultivation in Bihar and Bengal, breach of contract initially fell within the purview of criminal law in the 1830s. Though the institution of the Civil Procedure Code and the Contract Act had shifted it to civil law, the provisions for imprisonment continued till 1926 in India, as opposed to England, where penal punishment was abolished as early as 1875. The penal consequences of the debt bond bolstered the system of indenture. As a result, when the government of Bengal contemplated abolishing imprisonment for Parda-Nashin women for breach of contract in the 1880s, the Association of Bengal's Landed Gentry, the British Indian Association, warned against its general application. They argued that the revocation would sap the foundations of Indian society in relations between the debtor and the creditor. The alarm, however, was unwarranted, as evidenced from the testimony of the Judicial Commissioner of Burma as late as 1893, who stated, next slide, please. In the last stage, the peasant proprietor becomes a mere serf and signs a service bond, which enables the moneylender landlord to imprison him for debt if he ceases to work for his creditor. The discussions regarding the amendment to the Contract Act in 1893 were informed of the problems that the administration had actively fanned. Officials acknowledged that the financial and juridical apparatus that pincered the peasant and aggrandized his rapid decline into servitude. Some, like Durga Dutt Joshi, the Munsif of Bilgram, documented the operation of debt bonds and its pervasive circulation in the countryside. Next slide, please. And when the harvest time comes, the landlord, himself an impecunious man, presses hard for his rents. He will not wait till the tenant can sell his grain in the best markets. So the latter has no option but to propitiate the Mahajan. The latter pays the rent. This done, he assesses the grain at Mahajani rate, which is more disadvantageous than the bazaar rate. At this point, the peasant was firmly under the grip of the Mahajan. Apart from interest, the latter would fix a penalty for impending default. Following default, the Mahajan would approach a civil court and attach the peasant's standing crops as the terms of penalty. The problem then concerned the operation of credit and cash advances that allowed the merchant moneylender to maintain price domination over the riot's produce. According to the report of the Bengal Provincial Banking Inquiry Committee in 1928, though Satta Patras were undertakings to deliver fixed quantities of produce at much below market price, borrowing on such unfair terms was possible. Satta Patras were comparably equitable to the terms of other distressed loans. The secretaries of the Berar Sarvajanik Sabha informed the Commissioner of Hyderabad in 1894 of Launi agreements, where the peasant received a third or fourth of his crop's market rate in lieu of a cash advance. These were similar to the contracts penned by Dadandars in Bengal, in which an excessively high interest was disguised in the procurement price of the produce. While credit advances crippled the agriculturalist while planting, his powers of negotiation remained as anemic during harvest. In the monsoon months, when the jute crop was weeded and harvested, and the almond rice crop was transplanted in Bengal, the rate of interest on cash loans jumped from 2 to 3% to almost 16 to 17. It was during harvest, however, when the peasant needed immediate liquidity to meet his many cash obligations. The least of them involved the expenditures on Eid and Durga Puja, festivals which coincided with the jute harvest. The heavier payments included rental and land revenue payments. While rental dues had plateaued on paper, monetary rent still exceeded the concomitant rise of crop prices, or the bump in prices was mitigated by the increased cost of cultivating infertile land due to the shrinkage in available acreage. The punctual enforcement of revenue collection by intractable revenue officers exacerbated the peasants' problems. Several administrators believed that most collectors regarded the moneylender as an adjunct, not an encumbrance to the system of collection. Added to this was the illegal exactions charged by landlords in the forms of abwabs, the levying of which grew increasingly common once the Tenancy Act placed checks on the enhancement in rental rates. The tightest squeeze, however, came from the moneylenders themselves, who turned remarkably inflexible regarding loan repayment during the harvest period. Faced with the threat of court proceedings, cultivators were forced to sell their produce at farm gate prices instead of holding their crops till the market generated a better purchasing rate. The outcome, of course, squarely benefited the merchant usurer, who secured his supply of raw commodity well below its market value. Importantly, this crunch in the riots' liquidity was forcibly maintained. To that end, Shahid Amin notes that for the sugarcane farmers in Gorakhpur, in a world dominated by consumption, seed, and rental loans, the rigid enforcement of kist payments by a colonial legal regime assumed a force of its own. Official aspirations to provide relief were also thwarted through the actions of powerful lobbies, as seen in the case from Dhaka in 1914, where the district magistrate recommended a loan of 2.5 lakhs for the riots, reeling from a dramatic fall in raw jute prices during the beginning of the First World War. European bailers, however, viewed the loan as a form of temporary liquidity, which they believed would help peasants hold their crops till they received better prices. As a result, they applied pressure on the government through the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and had the loan rescinded. So apart from cash loans, small peasants also relied on grain advances to meet their food requirements through the year. Shahid Amin takes this as an evidence of the great difference between the working time and production time in peasant economies. Since the production cycle of crops enveloped and exceeded labor time, and mechanized manufacture and the glut in rural consumption had led to a decline in artisanal production, cultivators who had earlier interspersed their labor between farming and manufacturing required subsistence loans regularly to see them through unproductive period. The evidence of subsistence loans reinforces the credibility of two ongoing arguments: the alienation faced by peasants in holding and marketing their produce, and their feeble position as consumers. Why were even grain cultivators unable to store enough produce to see them through lean seasons? The lack of storage facilities was a pervasive reason, but the confluence of artificial strains was likely more responsible for this anomaly as well. A compelling factor concerned the shift in rent collection that moved from cash to produce towards the end of the 19th century. The transition in many cases was enabled by dominant agricultural groups like the Moga Jats, the Kunbi Patels, the Jotedars of North Bengal, and the Gurjars of the central provinces. These landed communities were looking to tussle monopsony away from merchant moneylenders and control the marketing of grain themselves. The nature of native money markets and the structure of credit financing, however, impeded their success in displacing the commercial class's hold over procurement, storage, and marketing. Both Rajat Ray and Tirthankar Roy agree that it was the seasonal velocity of money markets, as well as the access to liquidity, that aided the latter. Urban bankers, who found unsecured rural lending too risky, preferred to have their capital trickle down through the hands of commission agents and local mahajans, who, being familiar with the social structures of the village, were better placed to recover the advances. In some cases, Kacha Adhatyas or commission agents were also financed by managing houses or by European wholesale exporters and charged with procuring produce either directly from peasants or from farias and beparis. The First World War and the Great Depression jarred this arrangement as export houses like the Raleigh Brothers and Walcott gradually withdrew their agencies and capital from the interior. This left the procurement of produce, particularly grain, in the hands of native financiers who supplied capital to commission agents for inland procurements. While it was the Marwari and the Bhatia communities who controlled the trade in staples in the Bombay province, in Bengal and Bihar, rice was controlled by the credit apparatus set up by Marwari Amdawalas. Pakka Adhatyas also often complemented their procurement with goladari, which was the storage of grain, a service that richer peasants availed of in lieu of short-term advances. These goladars were the nodal links in the produce trade, as they procured, stored, and sold commodities to mills and export houses. They even made advances on the basis of their holdings. The virtual monopoly of the indigenous mercantile and banking classes over grain made it one of the most speculated commodities in colonial India in the early 20th century. The speculation conducted either through futures exchanges, Badni Ka Satta, or through options, Teji Mandi, was dependent on the amount of grain stored in the khattis or the grain pits of the goladars. As seen from the case of Bengal in the early 20th century, goladars did more than just store grain. They looked to corner its market as well. A corner is when a distributor attempts to gain sufficient stock of a commodity in order to manipulate its prices. So pulling off a corner involved a degree of secrecy regarding the details of a trader's stock. As a result, it was crucial to secure produce through regular but clandestine channels. This was why native merchants preferred to finance their agents with channels of capital that circulated outside the ambit of the imperial bank, since, quote, the bank's practice of advancing against produce gave too much publicity to the transaction, and merchants were unwilling to disclose how much grain they actually held. This was also why some usurers often did not write down the terms of loan agreements, like in the case of paddy loans, where even in the absence of a legal pledge, the lender generally sent a man round the time of harvest and took away his share of the crop. In the context of Uttar Pradesh, for example, Eric Stokes claimed that the crop, wheat was grown mainly for the banya and the revenue collector. The fact that the peasants of Bundelkhand, who were mostly subsistence farmers of millet, switched to an exchange-oriented commodity suggested to Stokes that, quote, the engine of debt was driving the expansion of the cultivated area of cash cropping to artificial high levels in the region, end quote. This scramble for monopsony over grain exacted either through rent or through debt repayments generated a perennial shortage of food grains for the actual cultivators themselves. Although the phenomena was exacerbated during the First World War, it was by no means a 20th century occurrence. In fact, grain advances like Bhojed Dheri, where interest ran as high as 50% per annum, was quite common in Bengal by the late 19th century. This avaricious acquisition generated its own vicious cycle, where having repaid his debt to the moneylender, the peasant was immediately forced to incur another one to secure his subsistence for the coming season. This cycle of domination had prevented cotton-growing farmers of small talukas like Dhulia in Maharashtra from realizing the profits of the boom of the 1860s. Little seemed to have changed 30 years later, as reported by the Munsif of Tilhar, Ahmed Khas Ali. Next slide, please. Sorry, no, the one before this. No, one before this as well. After this, please. Yeah, this one. In Hamirpur and Jalaun districts, a well-known money-lending class called Marwaris have of late become landholders. Here, I found that the entire produce of tenants' holding goes to his landlord, who takes it in payment of rent and partly in satisfaction of his bond debt. The poor tenant has, in fact, no grain left to live upon or to sow the next crop, and consequently applies to his creditors again for beej and khawai bonds. The preponderance of such agreements stirred doubts regarding the sanctity of the moneylender's necessities in the context of unsecured lending. Noting that the highest interest on seed loans was charged usually after a drought or a failure of harvest, a district judge from the Northwest provinces, T.A. Redfern, concluded that it was greed, not the risk of unsecured lending, that spawned high interest rates. The lender's dubious circumvention of legal safeguards further soured opinions. The provisions of the Dara were almost immediately enervated by the Banya and the Saukar, who continued demanding title deeds as securities for loans or shifted their preference from mortgages to direct sales of land. Land also became the collateral for Dadan loans, where interest was embedded in the price differential between the selling price of the title deed and the cost of its repurchase. The manipulation of interest rates was also creatively managed. While the Negotiable Instruments Act prohibited compound interest, there was no equivalent law for money contracts. Specific laws that were operational in certain districts did, however, openly prohibit compound interest. The Sautal Parganas was one such place, where Section 24 of Regulation 5 of 1893 placed conditions on the terms of lending. Still, the Deputy Commissioner of the region, R. Castes, complained that moneylenders would draw riots outside the boundary of the Sautal Pargana and execute bonds where the law was inapplicable. His distress was compounded by the discovery that written bonds often misstated the loaned principal. In many cases, it was greatly exaggerated to justify the amount collected in interest. It was the riot's illiteracy that disabled him from verifying the terms of the contract at the time of drafting. The Munsif of Lucknow, Mirza Ismail, alerted his superiors of a further cunning, which limited the power of even sympathetic borrowers, sympathetic arbitrators. Next slide, please. Basically, I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but instead of charging compound interest, simple interest for 6 months was charged repeatedly, and this is how it was compounded. The quote is up there. A conspicuous reason that enabled lenders to skirt legal safeguards was the help they received at the lower end of the judicial order. Syed Ali had cautioned the government that Mahajans regularly combined money lending with the legal profession, a warning that was borne out in the reports of other officers as well. The Judicial Commissioner of Burma directed his suspicions towards subordinate judicial officers and insisted that since they were recruited from the banking classes, their sympathies lay with the moneylender, not the borrower. He referred to them as white-clothed classes, Brahmins and Banyas, writers and traders, all ready to lend money if they can to the very persons to whom the Rayat have now been cast as prey. End quote. So the confluence of coercion and legal overreach that had sunk the indigo cultivators in the early 19th century persisted well into the 20th. The Rayat remained outmatched in both capital and cunning and could hardly be described as a free agent who transacted on even footing with the moneylender. The proof of his bondage was reinforced by his limitations in finding alternative sources of credit. Lenders rarely sued to recover loans, but showed tremendous alacrity when they sensed that a borrower had approached a different margin to contract a fresh loan. This long appraisal substantiates some of Ali's concerns regarding the candor of rural credit relations. He admitted that the lender's necessities informed financial agreements, but questioned those agreements when necessity itself was induced by one of the transacting parties. In the eyes of such officers, the distinctions between free market contracting and taking a loan at gunpoint was fading quickly. Bipartisan opinion, however, was more eager to hold the asymmetry between the peasant and moneylender's intelligence accountable for gestating the structural faults in commercial farming. The discovery was old and the arguments were therefore recycled. Officials reviewing the incidents of the Deccan riots had alleged that sharp-witted usurers had manipulated the system against a dumb-witted peasantry. The complaint was repeated in the Famine Commission's reports of the 1880s and was littered in the official correspondence regarding the amendment to the Contract Act in 1899. Sample a limited selection. Pandit Tribhuvan Nath claimed that, quote, the Mahajan is always too clever for the ignorant and simple khud kasht kar. While the subordinate judge in Lucknow, Pandit Bhakt Narayan, described the peasants of the interior of Awadh as needy and poor and illiterate rustics. A munsif at Lucknow, Kali Charan Bose, commented on the disparity of intelligence between the money-lending class and the poor agriculturalist, end quote. The munsif at Tilhar, Ahmed Khasali, insisted that in many districts, the quote, executants of bonds are illiterate and unable to understand the contracts they enter into, end quote. A statement that found resonance in Justice Chatterjee's note from Punjab, who claimed that the difficulties of agricultural debtors in their dealings with moneylenders arise from their utter ignorance and want of education. Accordingly, the Deputy Commissioner of Gurudaspur, J.R. McConaughey, advocated for the immediate implementation of the amendment that would provide, what he claimed, protection of the ignorant and stupid against knowing and intelligent. So who could be charged with restoring this parity? British officials had withdrawn hopes regarding the zamindar and were unwilling to be persuaded otherwise. Functionally, he was a relic of an unproductive era, unlike the moneylender, who was crucial to the ongoing machination. To that end, officials reiterated the native zamindar's non-industrious and apathetic spirit regarding the improvements in cultivation. The congealment of such opinions over the late 19th century outlined an impression of native proprietors as an extravagant and improvident class of people, an opinion that was reflected onto sub-infeuded petty landholders as well. Since zamindars couldn't be entrusted with protecting the ignorant from the knowing, a majority of officials chose to repose their faith in the judiciary. They could, it was argued, restructure a contract or declare it void when they found its terms unconscionable. The suggestion, however, was vetoed by a majority of judges themselves. The district judges of South Malabar feared that the criteria of simplicity, if it was expanded to accommodate common ignorance, they felt then the difficulty would lie in the practical determination by the courts to what degree of simplicity is entitled protection, thus turning judicial decisions inconsistent and arbitrary. Next slide, please. Outranking all other concerns was the fact before this. Yeah. The judges consider any such change undesirable because the court, not knowing the facts beforehand, might view with suspicion many circumstances not really suspicious, and might thus be led to useless inquiries entailing much waste of time and expense. This warning regarding the limits of judicial omnipotence resonated with tones of market determination, an argument that Friedrich Hayek would later amplify in the context of bureaucratic state planning. A subordinate judge from Nainital, John Edge, put it quite bluntly when he admitted that a 20% rate of interest on a loan with good security may be high, while even 70% on an unsecured loan could be low with respect to the risk the lender was running of losing not only interest but principal as well. What I desire to point out, he asserted, is that neither a judge nor anyone else could say that the agreed rate of interest was unconscionable unless he had before him the circumstances under which the loan was applied for. As a result, the judiciary chose to pass the buck onto the legislature, which showed limited enthusiasm in passing a new usury law along the lines of Act 28 of 1855. Why did the state itself not become a creditor, especially when it found regulating private credit from the outside so challenging? It tried, but it was too removed and informationally ill-equipped to understand the relations that structured rural credit. Its attempts, therefore, appeared insincere. In spite of the underdevelopment in public banking, tentative forays were made into agrarian lending through the Land Improvements Act in 1871. The Act sanctioned advances with an interest rate of only 6.25 for the purposes of land improvement, particularly irrigation works, and for the reclamation of wasteland. The plan for these loans drew on the Mughal system of takvi, which were advances authorized by Mughal revenue officers for meeting the peasants' seed and cattle costs. 11 years into its working, Sir Charles Crosthwaite declared the Act a complete failure, as the total advances under the Act for the whole of India do not come to more than 4.5 or 5 lakhs at the outside during the year. End quote. The Famine Commission's report in 1880 concluded that apart from procedural problems, it was the recalcitrance of collectors to lend without security that led to its inefficiency. Act 26 of 1871 was followed by the North Indian Takvi Act of 1879, the Land Improvement Loans Act of 1883, and eventually the Cooperative Credit Societies Act of 1904. None of these proved to be effective competition against private usury, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the state had almost completely withdrawn itself from financing improvements or for providing funding for agrarian production. Reflecting on this failure, the government provided a list of reasons why its schemes did not work. The Bombay Banking Inquiry report concluded that moneylenders are willing to make loans for even unproductive purposes, like social ceremonies, subsistence costs, and capital required to meet a separate loan, which the government was unwilling to do. This was particularly true in northern India, where the quote, the Rayat has no transferable interest in his land, which he can offer as security, and the only interest he can offer, his crops, are previously hypothecated to the landlord or to the Mahajan. End quote. These problems were alien to Mahajans and Zamindars turned usurers who were deeply embedded in rural society. The Bengal Banking Inquiry report estimated that by 1928, about 80% of the number of loans advanced by moneylenders were unsecured versus only 20% that were secured in Bengal. Again, in the context of the Loans Act of 1883, the Commissioner of Berar claimed that private usurers saw the government as competition and denied advances to peasants who had borrowed from it. While the Banking Inquiry report admitted that cooperative societies were gaining some traction amongst rural borrowers, quote, a great many people are still lured to the moneylender, they complained, because he would lend in secret, without security, without inquiring about the purpose of the loan, and without demanding punctual repayment. Added to this was the cultural reputation of the Banya and the symbiotic relation he shared with his borrowers. This fact was acknowledged by officials like R.S. Aikman in 1893, who reminded the government that, quote, all moneylenders aren't village Shylocks. Many fulfill useful functions, end quote, lending weight to David Hardiman's description of the paternal shade, whose relation with the peasant exceeded a simple transactional exchange. The characterization is corroborated by the relative absence of widespread anti-moneylender uprisings in late colonial and even post-colonial India. When they did occur, they threw up two specific demands, rather than general antipathy. One was the destruction of accounts and ledgers, and the other was the continuance of subsistence loans. While some officials placed urgency for amending the Contract Act, tying it to the question of land dispossession amongst peasants, it is worth asking whether their fears were genuine or a red herring of sorts. Indeed, the threat of political instability was serious enough for the government of Punjab to pass the Land Alienation Act in 1900 and for the government of India to amend the Contract Act in 1899. I would argue, however, that the socio-economic changes in agrarian production witnessed at the end of the 19th century were more to do with establishing a monopoly over agricultural commodities than the land itself. Given that usurers were not interested in evicting peasants or even repurposing their land for non-cultivating purposes, it made little sense for them to keep capital idle by entering into direct purchases. It was only during periods of exceptional crisis, when the lender feared that loans would become irrecoverable, did they take actual possession, like between 1893 and 1903, when droughts, floods, and famines swept the Narmada Valley, or when raw jute prices collapsed following the Great Depression in the 1930s, and a large section of Bengali riots slipped into the dispossessed category. It was more common for peasants who mortgaged their occupancy tenures to continue possession and cultivation with inferior rights, usually translated as higher effective rents collected in produce. In fact, by the 20th century in Bengal, the annual collection of interest payments were much heavier than the payments made in rent. But it's also undeniable that the fear of land alienation and its political fallout was far more than just spectral for many within the colonial administration. For those looking to restore the balance of power between the lender and the peasant, the disparity in social and economic status, and more crucially, in intelligence between the two, appeared overwhelming. Next slide, please. Characterizing peasants as minors who were yet to come of age, Ashton concluded, native cultivators, who are mere children in many respects compared to moneylenders and traders with whom they have to deal, are entrusted with unlimited powers to alienate their occupancy rights. So on the basis of these discussions, a draft bill was prepared in 1898 that addressed the question regarding the borrower's intelligence, simplicity, ignorance, and necessity, as well as the lender's ability to dominate, act in good faith, or be on equal footing with the borrower. The bill, however, was met with general disapproval when it was finally circulated. Clauses regarding the lender's ability to dominate the borrower, or whether the lender and borrower were contract on equal footing, were dismissed as being vague or procedurally unenforceable. The Rangoon Chamber of Commerce could not imagine a situation in which a lender did not hold some sort of leverage over the borrower. If every lender was in a position to dominate the borrower, they remarked, contracting on equal footing appears impossible. Notably, the question of simplicity and ignorance were dropped entirely. The final assessment of reviewing officers was that as a principle in law, these terms were, quote, excessively difficult, probably impossible to state in a language that may not be misunderstood or manipulated, end quote. In fact, since the lender did not enjoy a fiduciary relation with the borrower, some felt he was shielded to the question of domination entirely. Even while expressing sympathy for small cultivators, a majority remained convinced that the government ran the risk of spoiling the Contract Act and produced results in regions beyond the sphere of the question of agricultural indebtedness. Specifically targeted laws like the Deccan Agricultural Relief Act or the Sailors and Merchants Shipping Act were deemed more effective, since they targeted specifically vulnerable groups. As a result, when passed in 1899, the amendment was ineffective in providing the radical protection it had promised in its decade-long contemplation. It became a historical footnote, a dead letter, which the banking inquiry reports described as, quote, half-hearted, and one that, quote, did not touch the fringe of the problem. Here I insist that we read the failure of the amendment vis-à-vis the success of commercial farming as a mode of production and expropriation. Over a series of publications, Jairus Banerjee has urged readers to treat commercial farming as an instance of a well-developed system of commercial capitalism. For Banerjee, commercial capital was not subservient to or an agent of industrial capital, since its role exceeded that of circulation of wealth generated by industry. This was even truer for the distinctly colonial system of commercial farming. Building on Henry Bernstein's argument regarding the exploitation of peasant household labor and A.V. Chainov's concept of vertical concentration of producers, Banerjee argues that trading and finance capitalism integrated small peasant farms within a capitalist commodity market and, quote, established the domination of capital over sections of the peasantry with no necessary effects on the organization of production, end quote. So, even as smallholding peasants retained control over the means of production and the way in which it was organized, the household form, the, quote, aggregate labor of the household was exploited through a system of price domination, end quote. According to Banerjee, This system of appropriation represented the formal, if not the real subsumption of labor by capital, and the debt relations produced through advances should be read as the wages earned by laborers in conventional systems of capitalist farming. The reason it has not, he argues, is due to the tendency of several, next slide please, due to the tendency of several Marxist historians to mistakenly conflate the relations of productions with the forms of exploitation. The argument is just on the screen, but I'm not going to read it out. It's just that. In drawing this distinction, Banerjee's formulation resists a conventional historical teleology. Mercantile or commercial capital organized through a putting out system was not simply the prehistory of an industrial mode of production, nor was it a pre-capitalist form of appropriation. For Banerjee, in this system, next slide, please. For Banerjee, in this system, middlemen like the Banya, the Mahajan, Adhatyas, Beparis, and Goladars were scarcely extraneous, dispensable elements of a system that could have worked just as easily without them. They were the system. They were how the chains of commercial capitalism, straddling the world's main commodity markets, were structured. Importantly, the system was cost-effective, since the commercial cultivation of crops like sugar or cotton never transitioned to slave or indentured plantation forms as they had in America or the Caribbean. Here, it is worth reproducing B.B. Chaudhary's disclosure of the testimony of an indigo planter who confessed as early as the 1850s that, quote, no European farmer could produce either sugarcane or tobacco or any raw material as cheaply as the ryots, end quote. Again, Krishna Bharadwaj claimed that the labor-intensive jute crop was mostly cultivated through the household labor of Bengali ryots, who held 1.25 acres of land on average. Next slide, please. While speaking of the cost efficiency of this system, Omkar Goswami has argued that subjugating peasants to a capitalist wage labor system was not necessary for procuring jute at low prices. Small wonder, then, that the mills never considered it necessary to eliminate middlemen and radically transform the structure of upcountry trade. The case was similar for sugarcane growers in western Uttar Pradesh, who remained perpetually indebted to the Khansaris, who provided them with subsistence loans. More recently, Fahad Bashira has documented a similar phenomenon among small-holding Arab Pemba farmers in Zanzibar in the early 20th century. The cultivators were under the sway of Gujarati mercantile capital and survived off subsistence loans that were recovered through the acquisition of cloves and coconuts. Given the centrality of mercantile credit to agrarian production and the importance of its networks in storing and trading commodities, Bishara admits that, quote, any legislation that targeted the moneylender was doomed to lifeless existence in the books itself, end quote. By 1933, almost 2.3 million coconut and clove trees had been directly acquired by Indian moneylenders, and a nativist backlash seemed imminent. It's only then that the government in Zanzibar passed the Land Alienation Decree in 1934. Bishara claims that in official discourse, the Indian usurer was referred to as a rent-seeking parasite and a profit-motivated miser. Quite hypocritical for a state that greatly valued this class's importance for the purposes of wealth extraction and for the movement of commodities. Eventually, then, the paternal concerns regarding smallholding peasants dissipated once the demands of commercial cultivation were confronted. It was the efficiency of relative costs, both for production and acquisition, that won out at the end. Crucially, it was a distinctly colonial legal and economic framework that actively produced and maintained the peasants' indebted condition. Even if material gains may have driven government policy, in discourse, it was the rationality of political economy on which the system was justified. Next slide, please. When documenting the reasons for the failure of the Usurious Loans Act of 1918, the Banking Inquiry report of Bombay admitted that it was the baffling effects of decisions of high courts and privy councils which had practically made the act a dead letter. The trend of rulings is to impress on subordinate courts that they have no power to interfere with contracts solemnly entered upon. Discretion of courts is fettered by judicial decisions which are tending in favor of creditors. Rulings of Privy Council stand in the way of reducing interest rates unless certain things can be proved. This was a repetition of Justice Amir Ali's assessment from 1892, when the question regarding the amendment to the contract first arose. It is more than likely that Ali himself was disappointed by the amendment as it came to pass. So what were the underlying reasons that for the amendment's impotency? Eventually, the amendment to the Contract Act did not elide the question of inequality. Instead, the discussions from 1892 to 1898 concluded that the contract generated equivalence in the absence of equality. The contract was therefore an agent of colligation, one that stitched asymmetrical relations faultlessly. It produced a relation amongst heterogeneous individuals in a manner that mediated their unequal position without annulling them. It explained inequality as a social and economic reality and understood the contract as an agent for organizing both market society and the practices of government around it. It was only when this heterogeneity or inequality was taken as a pre-given that the principles of contracting made any sense. In fact, two judges of the Chief Court of Punjab were amused that many had only just uncovered this truth. Justice Rowe felt that, quote, next slide please, taking advantage of another's necessities is the principle of most persons engaged in business and not merely of moneylenders dealing with agriculturalists. Justice Channing elaborated further. In the vast majority of non-commercial contracts, the parties are not on equal terms with reference to the contract. The experienced horse dealer, the retail tradesman, the professional jeweler are not usually on equal terms with whom they deal. But so long as they are not guilty of fraud or misrepresentation, complete fairness is not required to make their bargains binding. To tamper with this principle amounted to disassembling this act entirely. So felt the next slide, please. So felt the Inspector General of Registration in Madras. Aware of the bill's Aware of the bill's general objective, he felt, however, that the power proposed to be given to the courts might doubtless enable them to afford relief against really hard bargains in some cases, but it would not at the same time introduce an element of uncertainty in regard to the enforcement of legitimate contracts and hamper the operations of legitimate trade, where superior knowledge and skill, so essential to success, cannot be treated as disqualifying circumstances. The Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, Dennis Fitzpatrick, staged a reasoned battle on both sides of the principle. He even wondered whether the introduction of some sort of latio enormis into substantive law was the key to balancing political and economic needs of the government. The principle of latio enormis was an obscure and poorly cited Roman legislative principle that voided a contract if the price of purchase was well below the actual value of a commodity. This principle, however, went against conventional Roman jurisprudence that acknowledged the right of contracting parties to outwit one another in bargains. Despite the sympathy Fitzpatrick felt for the rights of his province, he found it difficult to insert his substantive concerns within the formal procedure of law. There was also the question of maintaining consistency in equivalent spheres of commercial activities. Next slide, please. Burdened by these considerations, he sublimated his protectionist sentiment as an unenforceable ideal and concluded, "I'm not prepared to go as far as to set aside a contract merely because one of the parties is too feeble-minded or simple-minded to enter into an unequal contract, and the other takes advantage of his weakness or simplicity." So, as a tool for only, next slide, please. As a tool for only mediating and not homogenizing difference, the contract became synecdochic for a market whose logic remained strategic. Here's how Foucault differentiates between strategic and dialectical logic. Dialectical logic puts to work contradictory terms within the homogeneous. I suggest replacing this dialectical logic with what I would call strategic logic. A logic of strategy does not stress contradictory terms within a homogeneity that promises their resolution in unity. The function of strategic logic is to establish the possible connections between disparate terms which remain disparate. The logic of strategy is the logic of connections between the heterogeneous and not the logic of homogenization of the contradictory. This indeed was the logic and function of the contract itself, to create connections between the heterogeneous with no intention of homogenizing them. The logic pivoted on the abstractions of political economy, where concrete social identities, that of the peasant and landlord, were replaced with between the peasant and landlord, were replaced with abstract economic identities, that between the borrower and lender. Clearly, as Ritu Birla has argued, the function of the globalization of contract law was to recode political subjects first and foremost as economic agents. This abstracted individual was then projected onto a collective called civil society, which came to be seen as the arrangement of economic men. So, having reduced the ignorant peasant to the irreducible, a borrower, the rationale of liberal governmentality demanded that the government wash its hands of further intervention. This logic, however, encountered a substantive contradiction. Within the universalist rhetoric of empire, difference, cultural, spatial, or epistemological, was mostly converted into temporal difference that corresponded to a stadial thesis or a theory of the stages of historical development. So, if European Enlightenment represented the final stage of civilization and capital, modernity, non-European societies were understood in terms of the temporal distance they maintained to the former. When difference was coded as time, races, cultures, practices, and communities could be categorized as backward, medieval, and primitive. In a nutshell, the West's past. The justification of colonial violence was often maintained through this discourse, where conquest became the white man's burden, charged with escorting the non-European other into modernity. While the civilizing rhetoric of empire partly dissipated in the period of indirect rule, the temporal ordering of cultures remained active nonetheless. Dipesh Chakrabarti sees the influence of this rhetoric in the post-colonial contemporary too, where temporal monikers like developing consign non-Western cultural and political forms to languish in the waiting room of history. If colonialism was a vehicle of a transition, then its mode of expansion and its tools for transformation involved disseminating the principles of political economy, whose doctrines, though harsh, were valued as pedagogical. Accordingly, the moral or substantive goal of political economy was not simply to mediate an existent heterogeneity, it was also to homogenize this difference through a promise of a shared modernity. Prathama Banerjee's The Politics of Time is perhaps one of the best expositions of this discourse. In the context of the Sautal Hul rebellion in the mid-19th century, Banerjee argues how usury was considered a necessary tool for civilizing the primitive. Building on George Simmel's arguments regarding the civilizing force of money, she demonstrates the efficacy of this belief amongst both British officials and the newly educated Bengali middle class. For the primitive to overcome their ahistorical condition, money's abstracting quality was considered instructive since it replaced the goals of immediate desire with long-term accumulation. If money cultivated the habits of saving, thriftiness, and non-material consumption, it also fostered a textured imagination of time, where the present was inflected with thoughts of the future. As a result, the terribly unequal terms of usury that the Santals were subject to were justified by members of the Bengali intelligentsia, like Shashi Chandra Datta, who believed that, quote, it was moneylenders rather than the missionaries who could civilize the aborigine, end quote. His assessment was not very different from that made by Robert K. Pringle, the architect of the land settlement and revenue policy of the Deccan, who described the Vani or the village moneylender as the only link between civilization and barbarianism. The historical trajectory of these arguments lead back to one of the architects of the discipline itself, Adam Smith, who famously advocated against government regulation in grain prices, even during periods of extreme inflation, since high prices would cultivate practice of thrift and frugality amongst consumers during lean seasons. So, along with fulfilling a historical objective of transformation, the principles of political economy also imparted a new morality. As David Graeber observes, the moral and theological force behind the statement, one should pay one's debts, was gradually converted into an ethic of personal commercial responsibility during the period of finance capitalism. This was the blueprint of a secular morality, a Protestant ethic, where financial and economic practice became signs of virtue. A similar language of duty punctuates the correspondence regarding the amendment to the Contract Act. Next slide, please. Some, like Justice Channing, were unwilling to even consider illiteracy as an excuse for hampering the commercial development of a society, and with it, the moral progress of its people. He said, the peasant knows perfectly what he is doing, but he thinks that perhaps he may be able to beg off performances of his promises. It hardly needs to be pointed out that the character of almost any people would deteriorate under such a system. For K.J.L. Mackenzie, the Commissioner of Hyderabad, usury and its crippling debt were uncomfortable necessities that introduced the ignorant peasant to the ethics of modernity. This was reflected in the writings of native authors also. Take, for example, A.F.M. Abdul Hai Bhawali's influential pamphlet, Usman Adarsh Krishak, Usman the Ideal Farmer, published in Maimansingh in 1920. Usman's financial position is very good, and he is free of debt, Bhawali tells us, which to him indicated signs of his religious piety. According to Andrew Sartori, this piety led to building of a better commercial self, one that was shaped by everyday personal habits like giving up tobacco and pan, hygiene, thriftiness, agricultural self-sufficiency, commercial savvy, unremitting diligence, and of course, religious discipline. For Bhawali, as Usman allowed the lessons of political economy to act through him, he also gained recognition as a pious Muslim and as a rational modern agent. The contradiction between the strategic logic of the market, and this is the last page. The contradiction between the strategic logic of the market and the substantive rhetoric of empire now appears clearer. For empire, the tenets of political economy facilitated the transition of the pre-modern to the modern, and its technologies, money, contracts, etc., were meant to homogenize the differences between the two through the medium of instruction. Within the internal and strategic logic of political economy, however, this difference was productive, and it was the function of the contract to mediate without actually annulling them. So, as a pedagogical device, political economy looked to instruct the peasant without instruct the ignorant without caring to alleviate his ignorance. Prathama Banerjee had noted that the primitive was introduced to commerce and usury in a manner where the experience of exchange was necessarily unequal. Since a majority of contracts already assumed that exchange was unequal, they also rendered one of the transacting parties as primitive, or more accurately, ignorant. What was the nature of this ignorance? As has already been argued, small proprietorship was the key to cheap production of several cash crops. So when it came to the production of commodities, the peasant was anything but a commercial simpleton. Far from an ontological condition, his ignorance began at the process of sale or at the doors of the market. So one of the many gifts of political economy was to render the commercially savvy into the commercial simpleton. In fact, a discourse that appeared eager to pass systems and communities into non-coeval temporalities, capital and pre-capital, relied quite significantly on the latter for building global commodity markets and the industries that relied on them in the first place. In the words of Bentham again, the agenda here was cost efficiency, not systemic transformation. So the practices deemed pre-capitalist remained central to the strategic logic of political economy, even while it claimed that these were rationalities it needed to overcome. Importantly, these temporal bifurcations harbored a long shelf life, which continued into the post-colonial period. Commenting on the Nehruvian period of planning, Ron Inden gives evidence of the lament of planners like S. Ambirajan, who felt that, quote, next slide, please. Even today, there is not one homogeneous economy in the country, but a medieval rural and alongside it, a half-heartedly modern economy. Inden astutely clarifies that the medieval here is not an unwanted past that survives into the present, but an unwanted condition of modernism that modernists dispose of by projecting it onto the past. Only as I have argued that the medieval is not an unwanted condition at all. Quite the opposite. Categories like pre-modern and medieval offer potential for expropriation in the name of mediation and modernization. Thank you. I'm sorry for running.
Thank you very much, Baishakh, for this very rich and sophisticated paper that presents very uncanny resonance with the contemporary and the recent farmers' movement. So we now have about half an hour for questions and discussion. Who has a question? Is there anything online at this stage?
Gaurav, please state your question. You can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Baishakh, for this very, very rich paper. And I thought that your reading of the Contract Act is productive in the sense that it can work sort of as a key for reading a series of legislations that were passed in the late 19th century. So for example, your idea of collegiality, your idea, your introduction of the way you used Foucault's strategic
Strategic logic.
Strategic logic, I feel, is really productive. And in that context, I wanted to ask you, where did, if at all, the Transfer of Property Act 1882 figure in the materials that you have read? And the reason I ask this question is because the Transfer of Property Act 1882 did something similar to what the Contract Act did, in the sense that it put severe restrictions and safeguards for like peasants entering into mortgage relationships in the countryside, whereas in the three presidency towns, as well as in Karachi and like Rangoon, it basically deregulated mortgage markets completely. So whereas if you're outside, say, the original jurisdiction of the Bombay High Court in Bombay, to effect a foreclosure, a moneylender would have to go to the court. So I'm just wondering, where did that really, if at all, figure in the materials you have read? And if it didn't, can you speculate why it may not have been so? And the second question I have for you is, and this is of course completely up to you if you want to answer it, is did you find any evidence of the peasant using the idea of him being a simpleton and turning it around, more strategically? As you were saying, it turns somebody who's savvy into, a figure of derision and pity without necessarily protecting that figure. Did they turn it around in some way in the materials you have read, to protect their interests? Thank you. It's a wonderful paper. Thank you so much.
Should I answer? Okay. Thanks, Gaurav. So I've actually, I've gone through so much, I had to make this a little shorter. So I've actually not entered the land question except for mention it very, very towards the end, saying that was it land or was it commodities that really was the, and I mean, since the time of the Deccan riots, this has been the question, with Charles Worth saying that it really wasn't a question of land, and, Kumar saying that it actually land transfers did take place. Regarding the Transfer of Properties Act, so at least what I could see in official correspondence was that the government itself was struggling with the fact that even if formally transfers were allowed at that point of land transfers could be made, especially for possessionary rights, informally they were taking place nonetheless. So the Takfi Act, for example, or the series of land laws that the Agricultural Loans Act, etc., they all complained that while there was no formal provision for the transfer of property, it was happening informally on the basis of lien settlements that would be imposed by Mahajans upon the peasant themselves. And the threat here was not really taking them to court as much as saying that we will cut off your credit supply. So that was the threat. And so therefore, for a while, the government also thought that should we make land transfers saleable, in the sense that should we allow for the sale of property so that peasants can borrow as against it as security. But then again, the problem was always to do with the fact that massive transfer of land was the fear that led to the Deccan riots in the first place. Punjab Land Alienation Act also takes place at the same time, around 1900, where there is this spectral fear amongst the government that land alienation will cause peasant uprisings. So therefore, that needs to be limited. But informally, at least from the correspondence that I found, it was taking place nonetheless. But again, not officially, not imposed through courts, but more through the threat of cutting off credit supply or cutting off money supply. The peasants turning it around. So again, unfortunately, and I don't have first-hand peasant accounts. This is actually based more on official accounts. So I can only read it as, in terms of the prose of counterinsurgency way. So, of course, there are many accounts where officials who are defending the fact that you can't hamper the Contract Act by actually introducing ignorance and simplicity as valid concerns for making contracts voidable. They cynically argue that peasants are constantly going to court and saying that we're ignorant and we didn't know that we had entered into these contracts, etc. But they read it cynically. They say that, they're actually very clever. They're taking you for a ride. They actually know everything, but they're doing this nonetheless. But again, don't have first-hand accounts. In official accounts, most of these arguments, they're either reported with, excessive sympathy, that poor peasants, they don't know anything, or it's with cynicism that these, cunning peasants go up to take the money and then go to the court and say that, we didn't even know, we had no idea, etc. And then they keep harassing the courts. And anyway, there is a problem in colonial in the colonial judicial order saying that we are getting too many cases and we cannot arbitrate for every debt bond that comes to us. We don't really know what were the conditions that led to the bond in the first place. So yeah, just.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Sorry, I have a question. I'm in the room. Maybe you can zoom out just in case everyone, anyone else have questions later. Thanks for this very enriching, very complicated talk to some extent. I mean, I would have maybe liked if you could have initially given an understanding of the backdrop in which this was actually inscribed. Because I mean, for whoever's not an economic historian, I think the Deccan riot is not a self-evident kind of, sequence of, Pune Ahmednagar country. And even, of course, the realities of post-colonial India that we know very well today were not existing then. Even the presidency of Bombay had different kinds of, sub-whatever divisions and so forth. And I mean, I, as a sociologist and anthropologist, very interested in land relations in Vidarbha, I mean, know a very similar and yet at the same time different scenario in the central provinces. So I had a question which is more to do with actually with the land questions precisely. And it's interesting that you just said that you hardly touched, somehow evaded that question, because I was interested to know how this kind of invention or genesis of an abstraction, contract and, consumers, producers, how these, economic abstractions, the way they historically emerged, translated into a transformation of land relations and became also to some extent a regime of dispossession before the emergence of the Land Acquisition Act. So, I wondered how you actually analyze this, or if you could go maybe without too much, detail and Foucauldian conceptualization, tell us what is the lesson of that in terms of the understanding of the transformation of land relations, because the riot from Deccan is also not the one from the Malguzari central provinces and not the same as, the Zamindar abolition regions later on, like in Bengal and so forth. So could you just elaborate a bit on that?
So basically so this is also a historically grounded argument in this particular period. So, I mean, the question of land transfer has been something which obviously occupies a post-colonial imaginary as well. But the transformation of land, the taking it from agricultural to making it a commercial property, is something which is far more common today than it was back then. So therefore, the argument that is being made during a particular period of commercial agriculture is that even if land transfers were taking place, it didn't in most of the evidence from banking inquiry reports, from famine commission reports, irrigation committee reports, from this contract act, it appears as though evictions weren't taking place. Land transfers just meant that you had debt bondage in terms of labor power. Land itself was not something that was being repurposed for industry or for highways or for, so therefore the question in post-colonial India regarding the question of land transfer, regarding the question of repurposing farming land for commercial property is something that is absent during this period at large that I can see.
I'm just saying this and interrupting because in central India, that's how the Gonds were mostly evicted from their land. And originally, I mean, they occupied the region, they had land in very large tracts, and the moneylenders and mostly the Marwadis, and I don't know how it happened exactly, but I'm interested to know if to you this sounds analogous in the way this happened in Vidarbha maybe, as it did not happen in other regions, because you don't have those Gonds and you mostly have Marathas and people who do not obviously let others take their land so easily in Western Maharashtra. But at least in central India, I think that's how, Peter Harnety and other people have tried to show this, I think. And that's how land transfers happen, or land evictions to some extent at least happen.
Okay. Well, I'm not exactly, I wouldn't be on firm ground regarding this particular example. But like, for example, peasants in the Raj by Stokes, like even when there is transfer of land taking place, what at least Stokes is arguing is that what happens is the substitution of millet farming for wheat farming. So again, eviction is not taking place at large, or the land is not being repurposed for something else. Rather, it's creating a system of indenture for commercial agriculture. And this is basically what Jairus is also trying to say, that instead of looking at capitalist farming to see that, like, to understand it in terms of first primitive accumulation, that you first take away the land, you then convert the people who were original landholders into wage laborers, and then you make them work on the land. let's understand it in the system of debt bondage, where you think of it in terms of advances in lieu of wages. So the advance is actually doing the work of both price domination of commodities as well as entrapment in terms of labor power. So this, at least for the period of commercial farming, I would extend that to be a more general way in which we're thinking about the land question. At least that's from my understanding of it. And of course, this is something that people have disagreed upon. I mean, this is a question that, you know, like whether it's B.B. Chaudhary with the question of depeasantization, whether, and then Rajat Ray and Ratnalekha Ray's response to him, Charles Worth, Ravinder Kumar. I mean, this question is always a debatable question, at least for the purposes of this particular period, where commercial agriculture is basically, where securing commodities is more important than securing land and repurposing it for non-agricultural purposes. I would say that the transfer question is something which needs to be historically placed. That's it. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions online? Please feel free to manifest yourself.
Yeah.
So at the beginning of your paper, Baishakh, you mentioned a consultation about undue influence. And I was very intrigued by that. So could you tell us more about who was consulted and how did the consultation take place? And was this usual at the time to organize such consultations?
Well, I phrased it as a consultation, but it was generally, it's a large report that was gathered, and mostly it was gathered from collectors, magistrates, in some cases, opinions of judges, revenue collectors, etc., as well as petty officials, munsifs, clerks, to basically give feedback regarding what undue influence could be, what the scope of it could be. So it was this large report that was actually collected from 1892 to 98, opinions circulated. And I think the majority of opinions were collected from 1892 to 94, and then from 97 to 98. And on the basis of this, the Contract Act, the amendment to the Contract Act was written or structured. But yeah, and I mean, at least for the kinds of files that I've seen, even related to gambling, etc., often this is how basically judicial or legislative opinions are collated. Or rather, legislative files are often like this, that, you know, you gather the data from people in the field in terms of, and so like for gambling acts, I've seen more police officials give data rather than revenue collectors, etc. But here, of course, it was revenue officials, munsifs, judges, who are also arbitrating these cases in their courts. Their opinions were collected, and on the basis of that, legislation was proceeded upon.
Do you have access to the reports?
Yeah, so it's the one most meaty file that I had found on this was in the British Library, which was on the amendment of the Contract Act, which had collated all this information together. But yeah, and then the rest of it is pieced together from some of it from the Bombay State Archives, some of it from, and others from the National Archives. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm Akhil. I'm a PhD candidate at South Asia Studies Department. So like Baishakh was my senior over there. Yeah, so my question is that when you were, so there were like different categories that you were addressing. There was like the judiciary, there was the state, there were the peasants, the moneylenders, and so on. But I was also wondering whether, you know, by the late 1880s, like the Indian National Congress forms up. And then, like, you know, into like early 20th century, they start growing in numbers and they start participating more in these kind of issues and resolving these issues. So do you know whether they were also thinking of the peasants as either simpletons or cunning people when they were trying to mediate and resolve issues? Were they working on any of these assumptions, or were they able to be more rooted in the local context and understand the role that the middlemen actually play?
Okay. So early associations, for example, like let's say the British Indian Association, these are mostly landholding associations. So there's zamindars or their moneyed classes. The Indian National Congress, when it's starting off, are more professionals, but they also have links to these associations, either bolstering them or opposing them at some level. It's commonly known that obviously that the higher end of the Congress leadership was formed by the classes who were exploiting. So basically what I'm also exposing here is possibly a Cambridge School thesis, saying that, that apart from the system of colonial extraction, which obviously the legal mechanism was provided by the colonials by extending these arguments, saying that, ignorance can't disqualify a contract, even if someone has been charged 300% interest or compound interest, where compound interest should not be allowed. Ignorance does not disqualify. The peasant has to pay, or the peasant has to give up his land. So the legal system is of course colonial, but the people who are actually operating the system, Mahajans, Amdawalas, Arhatiyas, Goladars, etc., these are also people who are forming the backbone of the Congress at some point of time. And for them, I mean, look at Shahid Amin's making of the Mahatma article. Most of, like, when peasant consciousness is acting in a certain way, one person is thinking that, burn, like Gandhi told me in a dream that burn down the Sheth's house. Someone else said that, kill the Sheth's cows. Someone else said that, like steal the Sheth's ledgers. But, but that's like a entirely like overcoming, acting on local issues, but through the figure of Gandhi in a particular way, where Gandhi becomes transcendental. But in the day-to-day operations, it's true that the Congress, to a certain extent, was looking after both money lending as well as, or rather, the interests of capital, rural capital, as well as big landholders in many cases. In some cases, of course, it wasn't. So where, for example, where Charan Singh is operating in Western Uttar Pradesh and the abolition of Zamindari Act is taking place, even there, like it's not really as radical as what the Congress is stating as its proposed purpose, as much as it is. So there's a huge difference between what it's stating and what the actual operation is, because they're also made up of these associations in the first place. Yeah.
Hello.
Oh,
We just had a question in the room. If you can just wait 2 minutes, Abhimanyu, we'll have Ines in the room ask a question, and then we'll take yours.
Okay, thank you.
okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So I was just wondering, this devious exploitative system, was it only British who imposed it on, well, Bengal and everywhere else in different ways, but let's say Bengal, since this is your case. But what about the longer history? What you mentioned, Mughal Empire. So Mughal Empire had its own system. How is it spilling into British system, or how is it completely changed? That's my
Okay.
concern.
Okay. As someone who's in 2 minutes, as someone who describes himself as a strict modernist, it would be difficult to draw a longer trajectory, because certain, like the Contract Act itself is such a nationwide Contract Act itself, appears as such a rupture in a certain way. I mean, like there are other people who have argued that, coastal areas, the Contract Act isn't cut out of whole cloth. In coastal areas where contracting had been taking place, there is no common convention that could group something like Gujaratis and Portuguese together. So there were abstract contracts that were written from a much more previous time. But again, so like I think I am placing this in a particularly historical moment when the Contract Act is also being written, when contracting is also coming in as a legal and an abstract legal concept, tied with the historical moment of commercial agriculture, which is replacing not replacing, but like revenue is moving, land revenue as the primary form of wealth extraction is moving into commercial agriculture, and India becoming a site for commercial agriculture, which is then supplying overseas industries. Of course, they're using, as I said, that Irfan Habib's work regarding lenders and borrowers, for example, or Mughal usury under the Mughal Empire. Of course, there are, even in spite of in Islam, usury is technically disallowed. But the widespread evidence of Mughal usury under the Mughals, and not just by Hindu communities or by trading communities, but even by Muslims themselves. When I was talking about the Takfi Act, for example, a land land improvement tax, these are also based on earlier Mughal forms for land improvement, which was a Takfi, or like a state loan that was given for building wells, for irrigation, etc. However, it's in the colonial period that they adorn a formality of their own. So, for example, collectors will only give money for if they can see irrigation or wells being done. And it's one of the reasons why often money would or like loans would be rescinded, because they would feel that the money is not being spent on agricultural improvement strictly. It's going towards rent payment, it's going towards marriage festivals, it's going towards something else. But again, so what I'm, just to come back to your point, that to draw longer lineage is something that perhaps it's also a failing, but it's also something that, since I'm starting with commercial agriculture and the Contract Act as this point where this is something very wholly new happening as a pan-Indian act, I don't have the tools to actually locate it to what is happening in pre-colonial, in terms of pre-colonial history.
Abhimanyu, will take your question, and it will be the last question we'll take, as we're already right on time.
So kind of you. I'm just wondering, so what was the market structure in terms of money lender? I mean, a general overall market structure of money lending business. Was there just a one or two money lenders in villages? Or was there collusion? There was lack of, no competition, because another money lender could obviously charge a lesser interest rate. So what was the general, structure of the money lending business? Thank you.
Thank you. So, of course, while some of these reports claim that the peasants were denied, if ever a peasant approached another Mahajan for a loan, then the first Mahajan would actually ask for his money back immediately before the other loan could be applied to. But there's enough evidence for this not being true, both in secondary literature. For example, even like J.C. Jack's report from Bengal in 1919, where a peasant would generally be indebted to at least 2 or 3 money lenders with different collateral, land, crops, jewelry, things like that. In terms of what was the structure of the credit, the thing with rural lending, and this is something that I think that Tirthankar Roy is one of the few people who's really worked on this regarding money market, in terms of native money markets and the seasonality of monsoon lending in particular, was that negotiable instruments did not circulate in the countryside. It was cash loans, and cash loans were something that urban bankers would not forward. But what would happen was that money would trickle down. So even in the, like, if one were to imagine a series of intermediaries, even in the case of money lending, so you have the Vani, the Sahukar, the Sheth, and then the Arhatya. But money is coming from Bombay and Calcutta. It's circulating in terms of negotiable instruments like hundis. And then money is being transferred. But in the final transfer, it's only being transferred in terms of cash payments, not in terms of any kind of IOUs. But there is a credit network in operation. The reason why one could possibly say that competition doesn't lower the credit rates is also because of the fact that there is a certain amount of collusion amongst money lending classes in these regions, especially given community networks in many cases. And also given the fact that community networks also facilitate for the transfer of money from urban banking sectors like Calcutta and Bombay to come to rural areas. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is clapping.
Okay.
Indeed. Oh, thank you, Baishakh. Thank you, everybody. Please feel free to consult the CSH website to know about our forthcoming workshops and seminars. I think the next seminar is the 3rd of April and with Mary John, and the next workshop is on the 17th of April, I think, with Jonathan Koshi. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.